Now we're going to set the first long table, and here's how it works. Here's how a long table works. We're going to do a few of them this week. Some of you may already know. So I've asked a small group of people to be in the first setting, to begin the conversation. So in this case, setting the table, Claudia Koppenberg, Marisa Zanotti, Harmony Bench, Ann Cooper Albright, Katrina McPherson, Lisa Bixler, Marisa C. Hayes via Zoom, and I will moderate only as needed. I'm not taking part in this conversation. The topic is Manifestos, Aspirations, Startup. Identifying the field, changing the field, shaping the field. So the initial group will speak to the topic, and as they finish their thoughts, what they have to say, they will individually make space for someone else to join the table and add to the discussion. That would be anyone else in the room. So if you wish to have a seat at the table, simply come down to the area behind me here where these seats are, I think maybe over there too, and wait for an opening. This is an organic process, so let's try to feel our way through the first one. But it really is meant to be a generous way to have a conversation that ultimately could include everyone sitting at the table at one time or another. There's paper on the table, there will be things to write and draw with to make notes so you remember what you don't want to forget. So when it's your turn to speak, you can speak. Please remember to use microphones when you do talk, although both the Aarons have the room mic. Those mics are going to make the rest of us hear better. So one last thing. I sent out a request to everyone to make sure to allow for generous time for questions at the end of your own presentations, whether it's an individual presentation or panel, what have you. We're going to depend on all of you to be mindful of time. We're going to remind you. Someone's going to sit down here and hold up a sign. But please do end your presentations 10 minutes prior to the end of your allotted time. If it's 30 minutes, 10 minutes before. If it's 15 minutes or more, if you have a longer panel or workshop, maybe 15 minutes or so at the end. But we want to have space for generous conversation this week as we move along. And I know that's sometimes it's maybe a late ask, but if you could be mindful of leaving time at the end for conversation, it would be great. So I want to say thank you again to all of you. I'll take, if there's a question about form or substance or something we're going to do this week, I'll happy to answer that question. I don't want to talk anymore about this because it's time for me to stop talking. And let's go to the table, please.
Deb, I have a question.
Anne.
I have a question about how people on Zoom can take a place at the table.
We're going to take a minute as you're setting up to move the projector back to the screen, and you'll see those people via Zoom on the screen.
Okay, and they can raise their hand.
And they can raise their hand. And Aaron's moderating, I think, or Kel's moderating the Zoom. Somebody's moderating the Zoom.
It will be moderated.
Yeah. It's a moving target. We're working on it. So thank you very much. Give us like 5 minutes and we'll be ready to go.
I thought it would, because this long table is something that was developed by a wonderful woman artist, I thought we should name her, Lois Weaver. She works in England, in London, and she devised the long table out of a very feminist impulse. And the aim of it is that it is constituted as a discussion on what and who is missing from historical accounts and what to do about it. I thought that might be a nice thing to remember. And historical accounts. So I think maybe what would be interesting in terms of our thinking around the field and how things work and maybe feminist practices is this idea of collaboration, networking, partnerships, and something that we're really interested in is to not have a center, as Doug was saying, to be open, to be generous, and perhaps to come back to a moment in history where after open source video dance in Scotland in 2006, which was led by Katrina, Simon Files and Carl J. Lewin, there was this idea that we needed to create a bit of a forum, and it was then Doug and Katrina and myself who were writing a funding application to the Arts and Humanity Research Council in the UK in order to create funding for Network, which we then got. So the Arts and Humanity Research Council gave us £46,000 to create a small network, the beginning of something, which were in the end were 7 academics from the UK and the US. And we have some members here, Harmony and Marisa and Anne. And the idea of the network was that we would be an open group who would travel. Yeah, we didn't have a fixed location. We traveled around. We met in Brighton, we met in Coventry, we met in Chicago. I'm trying to think, where else do we meet?
Outside Philly.
Oh yeah, outside Philadelphia, that's right. And we came from we obviously were supported from different institutions. So at that point, Katrina couldn't be part of it because she resigned from one of the institutions and was a freelancer. But she was very much in spirit there.
There was an empty chair, I think.
Sorry?
Was there not an empty chair every time?
In honor,
Or is
yeah.
that what you just told me to feel better?
No, it was an
one.
empty space in our heart.
It wasn't in fact an empty space, the space was there. Your space was there. So the reason why I'm sort of going into the details here is, in the first meeting of that group, we then decided very quickly we needed to do something about the field. The field needed a platform, a format somewhere that was dedicated, that was clear, that had rigor, that provided room for discussion and for ongoing discussion, so they didn't start each time with the same question, what is screen dance, for example, in a nutshell. And so we then decided as a group we would do a journal. And then we got more support, very amazing support from UB Madison, and particularly their printer, Parallel Press, who then printed this, supported us with the layout and the copyright and the printing, so we actually had some hard copies and the journal got off the ground. And the reason why this I think is important, because, and I'm coming here to Doug here, this is a question for you as well. I think Doug is distracted.
Sorry?
You're distracted. I'm going to come to you. I'm about to address something in particular, so I'd like you to listen. So, having just recounted the story of the network.
Please continue.
Okay. What this came to me when I was reading the introduction to your program, because you are mentioning the journal, and you're saying the International Journal of Screen Dance, and you say bracket founded at UV Medicine, bracket closed. And I thought this is really interesting as a kind of process of history making. Yeah, because there were these it started in Finton, or it probably started here before, and then there was Finton, then there was a network, and then there was the group of 7 academics. We didn't have a location. I think the decision to actually do a journal happened in the boardroom at Brighton University.
A restaurant.
A restaurant?
Yes, it was in the restaurant.
Okay, very good.
I'll tell that history.
Yeah, good. And now there's a short text here which is written by you, Doug, and a lot of people read your work. You have a lot of responsibility in the field. And this little history says, founded at UV Medicine. And I was just thinking, somebody who doesn't know this history, later on in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, what do they think? You know, founded at UV Medicine is kind of a 19th century language about there is a building and there's 5 people and there's a printing press and they're making a journal. Yeah, in some ways what this whole thing is not that anymore. You know, there's a network and there's all these people and everybody's done their bit. And there's these, and if we talk about institutions, there are at least 3 institutions, which is UB Medicine, absolutely, also University of Brighton, and the Arts and Humanity Research Council. Yeah, £46,000. It's not a small.
And OSU.
And
Well,
OSU.
and
OSU later on.
And all the individuals that came to open source.
Yeah, but in terms of institution.
I know, but
Okay,
exactly
yes.
to meet your point, exactly.
Indeed,
That's why
absolutely.
do we foreground in,
Point
why
taken.
are we foregrounding the institutions when
Yeah.
actually the whole point of open space, of open source video dance, was to get away from this format of there being kind of identifiable, even individuals, to be honest, because the thing that came out of the first one, of course, was the Manifesto, which was a collective endeavour and unfortunately I haven't learned it off by heart, otherwise I'd quote it, but it was a collective endeavour, and we very purposely didn't say it was those people that wrote it. It was, you know, so it was open source software. Exactly. So I totally agree with you, and it's an ongoing challenge, and it speaks to what Doug was mentioning before about this idea of gatekeepers. You know, as soon as we start to formalise anything, don't we put people in place that then can decide if this belongs or that person belongs or doesn't. So this continues to be the work, doesn't it?
But then that kind of anonymously, collectively authored manifesto, but then that collectively authored manifesto, maybe not two, maybe that's too much. Because of the institutions that we work in, because of the demands of academia, then it becomes difficult to cite. To whom do we attribute the authorship of this thing?
Yeah.
When did it arise? Where do we actually place it in its kind of historical moment?
Yeah.
And that becomes a big challenge.
It becomes a challenge, absolutely, yeah.
And also then how do we, what happens to this history in the process of being formed as a history? So that is the present, you know, it moves on as this and that and the other, and then we create a history. So the history now says in this preamble, Journal of Screen Dance founded at UW-Madison. Yeah, and so there's something which, of course, it's a very sole text, it's not an academic whatever, you know, it's just a little introduction. Nevertheless, you know, I think we need to be so careful to always and again think about what is the language that we use and what do we not say when we say something, you know.
Go for it, babe.
I don't even know where to start. I actually wanted to really hearing what you're saying, Claudia, but I just want to jump to the side and actually involve Lisa, because I think for me, although open source was a really, really important moment, and not least because it's the first time I met Doug, and I was thinking about that, about how, and I don't want to, I'm not meaning to sound like, before we had internet, but actually, before we had internet, the way that you found out about other people that were interested in similar things was people said, there's somebody doing that thing over there, and there's somebody, so when we sat down, Simon Files, Carl J. Lewin, and myself, to think about what we wanted to do, it really was, what do we feel the field that we are interested in kind of needs at the moment? And I mean, I use that word need, that sounds a little bit like we know best, but what did we feel we needed? And effectively what we wanted was to just get a lot of people in the room to talk about this thing that we were interested in, but to do it very much in a way that we tried to have a non-hierarchical approach so that nobody was foregrounded, and of course it was exclusive because only the people that were there were the people that were there, but in the way that we ran it, we were trying to make it completely non-hierarchical. And again, this brings the problems of how do you then notate that? So how do you attribute things to people, words to people, ideas to people? We had these scribes, I don't know if you remember, the scribes were there, and the scribes, it was wonderful because it acknowledged in the process of what they were doing that it was their perspective on the moment. There was no idea that there was a camera that was just capturing everything and would show you that later and say that's what happened. It was, this scribe's drawing, it was that scribe's photograph, it was this other scribe's notation, and we all notated everything as well on tables and bits of paper. So that becomes important, and I did forget to bring it, but we will have it there tomorrow. There are 2 publications from open source which try to bring together a lot of that material. But anyway, I also want to just hop back a little bit to, and we're debating when it was, but I think my feeling it was around about 1997, 98. Leitz and myself and Devrel, who were at that time young dance filmmakers, we devised something called Dogma Dance, and Dogma Dance is a manifesto for making screen dance. And I think, we had a manifesto, and I think for me one of the important things about manifestos also, I mean, as people know, I'm very big on manifestos as well, and one of them is, it's rather than telling us and showing us how you should do something, what it should look like, who should be in it, who should be doing it. It's a provocation. It's putting out there a vision for something, a potential for something that then you as an individual take and respond to. And it's interesting when I've gone back to Dogma Dance, over 20 years later, how many of the points that we had seem so important still and salient. And again, it goes back to this word for me of democracy, of opening out the field, of gesturing towards and saying, and I know this is fraud, saying this is as inclusive, you take it and you do what you want with it. And just one little tiny thing that I want to say about referring back to what we were talking about this morning and Doug mentioned as well, or maybe you didn't in your talk, but it was this idea of being with something rather than, my understanding was rather than kind of talking for it, you're with something. And it was making me think about the Gaelic language. And in the Gaelic language, there's no possessive, like you can't say anything belongs to you. There's no such thing as mine in the Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic language. And it's a pre-colonial language. And I think that's really, really important because one of the things that we're fighting against all the time, one of the things that we're fighting against all the time is this thing of ownership, and it's complicated because we also need to own what we say, but how do we do that in a way that does not exclude other people, does not exclude anybody as we move forward? But also just means that screen dance, let's say it simplistically, doesn't become one thing and not the other thing.
Or exclusive or entirely academically focused. And I think if you go back to the whole notion of open source, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure most of you do, I mean, that comes out of software, that comes out of the idea that you have the collective being involved in building something. And there is no ownership within that context. So if you think about owned software, Apple's a good example, probably got a lot of Apple stuff around here. It's a walled garden, completely owned. We have no access to the code. It is not open source code. It is owned by somebody. The idea of open source code is that anybody can get access to that code. Anybody can insert their ideas into it. They can improve it. And the irony is when something is open source, it can move faster, it can be improved faster, because you have a wide group of people who are able to go in and, say, fix bugs. So this is how it works within software. But it's important to note that that was the name of the first thing, and then that's the lineage that it's coming from. So this is where it gets really tricky around copyright and attribution. And if you listen to people like Eben Moglen, who talk about the importance of open source, who talk about the importance of things like Wikipedia, where you don't have an exclusive group of people within academia who are in charge of cultural knowledge. We're still in a world where that tends to be how culture operates. There are still gatekeepers, there is still a very hierarchical world, and it does keep a lot of people out. And I'd like to take this, in a way, into a very normative space, because I'm heavily involved in the Choreographers Guild, which is the union that's being set up to represent film choreographers, working across all film, whether that's dance film, short film, narrative feature film. They've never been represented before. They work in an industry where every other person involved in that industry has a union, especially in the US. Those entertainment unions are very powerful. Choreographers in that sphere were never represented. When I've been in on a lot of these meetings, and the wonderful thing about Zoom is it's allowed it to be very national across all of the US, and there's also been choreographers from the UK and Canada. One of the salient, really interesting things is when you look around that room, it's an incredibly diverse group of people, almost entirely made up of people of color, women, and it is also the one that has had the lowest status in the film world, that has been paid the least, and I think that has been kept out of a lot of spaces. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge that there's this whole other wider world of makers, of choreographers that are working in film. They're often working on YouTube, they're working on TikTok, they're working in other spaces. They are often kept out of this world. They are not invited in the way that I think we could, as we move forward, consider. And it's not necessarily deliberate, it's not people being mean, it's structural. It's the way that things are structured that often keep certain groups of people out. It's the language that's used that can feel very distancing and uninclusive.
I would love to jump on that or off of that. So Doug asked if Screen Dance has a center. And as I'm kind of looking across at who is sitting at the table, and Marisa, who is also joining us on screen, I think, yep, Screen Dance does have a center. And it's not just because we're sitting here as female presenting, white presenting, I'm not going to make assumptions about artists identifying or academically identifying, but I do think that we see a kind of reflection of what the center of Screen Dance is and has been. And so I just want to call attention to that as we're inviting some of this broader discourse with an eye toward aspirations and manifestos. And I do think that part of that is a history of jettisoning popular dance. That popular dance hasn't had a literal place at the table. Now, I will also say that Screen Dance, when we think of Screen Dance as dance film, that also has a history of marginalization. People are fighting for Screen Dance inside of typically dance departments. It's not that there's a huge representation of Screen Dance in film programs. So Screen Dance practices have already existed on the margins. Well, so has popular dance inside of these academic institutions where many of us craft our lives and make our lives. And so I think, as we go forward as a field, one of the things that we really need to think about is our kind of commitment to popular dance, to dance in all of its manifestations. As I look across the table, and if I think about the movement histories that also live inside of our bodies, there's another layer there as well. I think that in terms of a broader representation of dance forms in dance film is something that we need to kind of collectively look at as a field. So I think that we have a lot of work to do, and I'm really excited for that work to happen. I also think that there are really robust histories that we can draw from and draw into the field and into conversation. I also had another.
Go for it, Harmony.
Thanks, Anne, for the permission. So as a former editor of the International Journal of Screen Dance, which we were talking about, one of the things that we also saw is what kinds of authors are represented, what kinds of practices are represented, whether that is movement practices or whether that is screen-based practices. It's very difficult to find people who are writing about dance on TikTok and have that seen in a Screen Dance frame. And so I just want to have like the open invitation for people to submit their work to the International Journal of Screen Dance, because we also can't change the rhetoric of what Screen Dance is. And Claudia, I think that actually we never figured it out. We never figured out what actually Screen Dance is, and we are still constantly asking this question, which is also really exciting. But we need to have those additional voices in the academic literature because it's not just through the practices themselves, but also how they are written about, the kind of critical commentary. And Doug, this has been a kind of ongoing mission for you, is developing the critical commentary around dance on screen. And so what does that look like in 2022 going forward? This is like maybe not post, but ongoing pandemic. Our relationship to the screen and to dance on screen has really changed. So how are we as a field going to change in response to the world around us?
Yay!
I got a little manifesto-y there.
Yeah, that's good. So I'm going to pick up from there as the aging punk rocker on the and so we know all about manifestos. But I wanted to just come back to a kind of historical moment a little bit. So as many of you may know, I have really nothing to do with screen dance at all. I don't make screen dances, I don't star in them. And yet I came into this field in an interesting way because Doug had a little symposium at ADF when I was working on the last chapter of my Loie Fuller book, which was about technology and screens and stages. And I remember sitting in the ADF screening, you know, and these people screening dances and feeling, having come up through academia and knowing feminist film theory, that there could be some really useful discussions involved in thinking about representation and the role of the media, yes, in the role of the media itself, rather than just thinking about what was being displayed. So I remember feeling like, oh yeah, okay, that's a good role for me, feminist-ish. And I thought that, you know, we could push this kind of critical commentary or critical discussion to push the field, not just because we want to evaluate or from the position of an academic or from a kind of cultural gatekeeping, but because thinking and doing actually really go together well. And it's a good way to push a field past where it was in, you know, the early 2000s in my mind, and also bringing in history, you know, kind of referring to those earlier works that looked at film or even video. But one of the things I want to clarify, because I remember, Claudia, very clearly, when we were talking, and Doug it was before you published your book, you've been working, you know, everything had been happening kind of, but it hadn't come to the surface yet. And I totally remember saying, yes, we're gonna start a journal. Yes, we can do that. Because Doug was kind of, you know, oh, I've always wanted to do that. And, you know, it took the group to say, yes, we're gonna do that. Yes, we're gonna support it. And as an aging punk rocker, I want to say that that's very punk. Like, yes, we can do it. We can just do it. And I think that's an energy, that manifesto energy, is something that has driven screen dance from the very beginning. Yeah. And I think it's true in the open source. It was true in our network, and that there is some kind of energy there that, in fact, needs to continue in order for what you just asked for, harmony, which is in order for us to diversify the field, to open up the field, there needs to be a little more like, fuck you all, I'm gonna do it, you know, kind of energy. And so it's not just a question of a lot of, you know, kind of liberal white people saying, oh, we're gonna open up the field. But it's a question of also structural resources, but a little energy, like a little like, get down there and do it. Sorry. Energy. So you know, how do you contain that energy, or how do you inspire that energy? And I feel like that needs to be the next kind of network or the next symposium. The next is actually doing it, practicing, having a series of days in which we're not just talking to one another, but we're actually experimenting, scribing. You know, what happens when we take this paper and we put it in practice? And then people are made behind the camera. You never know.
Marissa would like to say something.
Yes.
I wanted to see if I could piggyback on something that Harmony said about the center of screen dance, and then also perhaps draw on some of that energy that Anne mentioned, because why not? That's a great, great way to move forward. I wanted to think about what it means to be someone curating, teaching, and making screen dance outside of an English-speaking country, because of course the Screen Dance Journal is published in English, and of course decisions have to be made about what is the best way to communicate. We can't all learn every single language. And at the same time, early on, I really appreciated the fact that the Screen Dance Journal mentioned that it would be willing to publish translations of text, and that is that articles could appear in their original language, and that there would be attempts made to translate those texts. And I think that this is something really important that we haven't quite arrived at just yet. And I think that moving forward, this would also be a very, very essential tool in developing and recognizing screen dance. So just for example, we have mentioned a few festivals earlier, and I know it's impossible to mention all of the festivals, but a large number of them were English-speaking or festivals that are found in predominantly English-speaking countries. So I think this level of outreach in terms of language is really important, especially because we tend to really fall back on this idea that screen dance is something universal that doesn't need language because dance, visual images, etc. But that actually, if we really do the work, we see that we really need to be able to do better outreach. We need ambassadors at the journal that speak different languages so that we can make those connections with people in other countries, in other languages, and really continue to build on this very international history of screen dance that we're still uncovering. So that's just a small remark that piggies back on this idea of centrality, where is the center of screen dance, and to remain vigilant about this question of language and communication.
I wanted to just say a few things. Also, thank you for the comment on English speaking. But the main thing that comes to mind is, why are we already not diverse? And it's kind of obvious, right? Because not only if you look at it, and we talked about this earlier, it's also, do you feel like you belong, and if there is a space. If you look at the journal, I've had many times that I thought I should write something, but I didn't feel like writing in the academic language that I see there, so I don't. I'll put it on my blog. Because who do I want to read the work? If we talk about inviting in, I find it also very problematic, because it means that you assume that people would want to be invited in this work. And I would really urge you to think, and also it really has a little bit of an idea of gatekeeping, so that people want to be in this space, but would they, and why? And so if it's not already happening, then maybe the next thing is to really look what is also already out there. And I really like your comment about popular dance, and what are people already doing that maybe in the elitism, coming from most of us from modern dance, which already is elitist and etc., etc. It's not to invite people in, they're there, why they're not here. That's all. And to say that, oh, we have to work harder, and let's open it, and the resources, I think it's sort of the reverse idea. You can't just gentrify a neighborhood, if you think about that, right? It's a neighborhood that's maybe like in Harlem, it's always been black, and then people move in. It's like people want to move in, how do you provide a space for people to move in? So those are the two comments for me, and also the big questions that need some self-reflection. Because the idea that you give permission to people to come in is problematic to me.
I removed myself. I'm just going to pick up a little bit from a few points ago, but I think also related to what's just been said, which is one of the things that I think have really seen over the last 20 years is lots of different ways of not just of making screen dance. So I guess what I'm interested in is not just the end point, but also the different processes that lead to something being made. and the way that those processes are supported in different communities. So I think, to follow on from what you just said, there's also something about learning, and it kind of also follows on from what Anne says, which is a kind of punk spirit, which is my kind of background of do-it-yourself, of DIY, of perhaps low production values, whatever that means. And it's something that I've seen, and I've been so excited to see in the last few years, with a real democratization in terms of, because we have phones that can make things, and we have technology that's small enough for women to pick up, and that we have communities that can produce their own work, that also that we don't always need to go for the super international, super global, but also that we start to account for the changes that are made by the films we make, by the small festivals we run, and by those things. So I guess my aspiration for a field that I kind of dip in and out in is just of learning more, and of making that learning visible and shareable. And I think the brilliant thing about the internet is that you can publish your blogs, and you can have your screen dance journals, and you can have all these different things, and they can be linked. They don't all need to be in the same place. It's a network, man.
I just got asked to come up here as an aging punk rocker who has a very big DIY spirit. I did take the last few years to try to just do it, and I can tell you that it is a very diverse field. There are many films out there, and I have seen many of them this year. We had 400 submissions, and I watched them all. Sorry, I'm shaking. I wasn't planning to do this. I'm going to take a deep breath with me. All right, so we had 400 films. I did the numbers, I did the metrics, gender, age, race, gay, straight. It was a beautiful, beautiful blend. Now the challenge is to show all of these films, right? And as you said, if you work towards showing the best, that's not going to happen at this point. So we showed a lot of films. We had to show 2 weekends of 80 films because we want the DIY spirit, as well as the beautiful, post-production brilliance of a broadcast quality film from France or Italy or the UK or where they come from, and maybe sometimes Canada where people are funded. And that's not what's happening here. It's just not. And again, and so we created funding. We created funding to help. We had a panel. Okay, let me tell you.
Who are you?
You wanted me to say this, right? Okay, here's things you might want to try that will make your life complicated.
Can you introduce
Who are you? Introduce yourself.
Oh, nobody else did.
What festival? What festival?
Pardon?
What's your festival?
My festival is Dance Camera West. My name is Kelly Hargraves. And it's lovely to see you all again after so many decades. So yes, we started a program funding films. We started a panel of 40 preview screeners, way younger, way more cool, and not middle-aged white lady like I am. My goal is to not have this festival move forward being, as you said, it's from a pocket. It has a very important feminist filmmaking history that I think, if you look at traditional film, it's very patriarchal. It's hierarchical, and we're not. There are no rules in dance film. Just to reiterate some of the things you said, it's open, and it's time, and it's possible, and I mean, thank you, COVID. It made a lot more people make films that didn't feel invited and who were waiting for permission and needed a space and needed a studio, and now they don't because we're all on the same level working at home. So it's possible. It's bleeping complicated. I'm really happy we did it. I'd love to talk to all of you about it. And we made 6 films by BIPOC artists that we premiered last weekend. And I want you all to show them. So I'm going to talk to every one of you and send you a link. Thank you.
I'm curious about what power means. We were talking about accumulating power in a marginalized field. That's interesting. What the power to affect something, right? That's how we measure it, is by how much I can make something be different. Which is, I guess, what we're talking about a lot anyway. So I don't feel like question is doing very much for me yet. after 15 years of, like, I spent the first 5 years going along with the debate about what should it be called, and then I spent 15 years being really annoyed with everyone who said what should it be called, and now I'm going back to, I think we need to talk about what it should be called. And I hate myself for that. But yeah. Yes. Yeah. I don't have a manifesto yet, but many other people have, and I think I'm generally more the person behind the people with the manifesto trying to pick them up, so maybe that's a structural thing with me. Any Zoom comments at this point?
No, they just wanted you to talk.
Say something.
Yeah, say something.
I've said some stuff. I will say more as the jet lag leaves me alone. Yeah.
We also have, we have 5 more minutes too,
Okay,
so if
5 more
anyone from the
minutes.
audience wants to come down.
So, and there are lots of open seats here. I want to pick up on something that Gabri said, and in terms of the Screen Dance Journal. I want us to be a little bit more imaginative about the division between blog and academic discourse. The Screen Dance Journal, because I'm on the editorial board and I read a lot of essays for it, it's not about academic gatekeeping. There is a rigor that we request about the writing, but I think that rigor is about intentionality and thoughtfulness, and sometimes I have found in the work of curating even something like workshops that people oftentimes write very quickly when they write for, you know, a blog or, you know, something that they send. And so I believe in the opportunity possible within very thoughtful, longer form essays. And I want to say that that is not necessarily or inherently elitist. It is something, we talked about Trinity Minha, we talked about Catherine Dunham, we talked about Maya Deren, people that take the time to really think about what they want to say, develop it over a series of drafts, I think are helping the discourse in the field to advance, and I want to support that. We don't have enough writing, actually, in this Screen Dance Journal. We're asking people to come on board. Oh, they're coming up now. All right. We need editors. We need people to participate. We need people to do that work as well. And so it's a step, you know, it's easy to say, let's open up to everybody. It's another step to say, in what ways can we seduce, encourage people to come on what is in fact a volunteer position? It's a lot of time and a lot of energy for no actual money. Now, that's why half the time those of us involved have other jobs. And I think that that is a kind of structural reality that also has, you know, certainly, you know, class, race, gender foundations. But I want to say that there's something important about thinking seriously, intentionally, with other people in a dialogue back and forth between younger people who want to write but aren't necessarily used to having the patience with the ideas. And I think that that's just something I wanted to encourage, and all you out there in Zoom land and all of you out there in the theater to really be willing to put the time in to write something that goes through that kind of back and forth. Because we do now, we're starting to have a literature, And I want to encourage more people to participate in that literature. And the Screen Dance Journal is a place we encourage conversations, interviews, all kinds of ways in which people can get ideas out. But it's a place I would maybe consider somewhere between, you know, kitchen conversations and back and forth texts and a book. That is an opportunity to work at that kind of longer essay format, to really give yourself again, for me it's an opportunity. It's a challenge, it's difficult, but it's an opportunity to really think through something over a course of years or decades or a lifetime.
Can I just ask if the people who still want to speak, and then we'll close the table?
Yeah, thanks, Anne, for that. And I wanted to build on that, to also talk about the journal as a platform. You know, what was really, really key for us from the start was to say we need a forum, like a seminar where we all get into a room or a dance class or here. The journal is also a platform where all these voices come together and then sit together in this space of conversation. You know, they all talk to each other and they talk to essays or whatever opinions that have been published before. And that is a huge point of making the effort of pulling them in, which doesn't happen so much with blogs or with other kind of, you know, you can have your own feed and maybe you can link to or hashtag somebody else or at somebody else. But this idea of a collective forum where there is this conversation between different views and where you speak to other people's views is a huge part. And that, of course, is a curatorial effort as well. Yeah, so you have these, and it's wonderful to devise an issue. Yeah, where you think, okay, what is my theme, what is my question, and what do I want to create as a sort of conversation, and then draw in people and get interest and solicit comments on that or contribution to that, yeah, which is a big part of the journal and a big part of the creative pleasure of it, actually.
I'm not actually going to talk about the journal, so I don't know if Marisa...
She has a comment, actually.
About the journal, yeah, I wondered that.